February 2008, police responded to reports of a shooting near an elementary school and found 36-year-old Marcos Salas lying on the ground. He had been walking hand in hand with his 2-year-old granddaughter when a car passed and opened fire. The bullets missed the child. Salas was hit over and over, collapsing there in front of the school. Minutes later, officers spotted a car carrying known members of the Avenue's gang. The driver didn't stop. The car pushed forward, cut through traffic, and turned onto Drew Street. Officers followed. By the time they reached the block, the suspects had already stepped out. Gunfire broke out almost immediately, multiple weapons going off in quick succession. When it ended, one of them was down, Daniel Clever Leon, Maria's son, lying in the street with a rifle beside him. By the time the shooting happened, the system behind it had already been in place for years. It was running out of a single house on Drew Street. Inside 3304 Drew Street, children slept, some as young as 3 months old, a crib pressed against the wall of a back bedroom, while in the next rooms over, men counted money, weighed narcotics, and answered phones that didn't stop ringing. Each call just another order feeding what law enforcement would later describe as one of the most brazen drug marketplaces in the history of the LAPD's Northeast Division. Steel bars covered the windows, cameras lined the eaves and fed into a monitor in the living room where someone kept watch, always scanning, while motion sensors stretched across the yard, set to alert the house the second anyone crossed into the wrong space. And on a shelf nearby, a shrine to Jesus Malverde burned in candlelight, rosaries draped over it, his painted face looking out over the guns, the product, and the money like a blessing that made sense inside that house, even if it wouldn't anywhere else. The house had a nickname. People in the neighborhood called it the Satellite House because of the enormous black dish that sat in the driveway for years, something you could spot from halfway down the block, as familiar as any church steeple. But to the people inside it, the ones who worked there and built their lives around it, the house felt like something else entirely, more like a command center, a fortress, the fixed point. Everything on Drew Street seemed to move around. This wasn't some corner boy operation. What was happening on Drew Street followed a system, tightly organized and controlled, with everything moving the way it was meant to. At the center of it all, the drugs, the guns, the surveillance, the lookouts on the roofs, the runners on the sidewalk, the money moving in and out like a tide, was a mother, an immigrant from a small town in the mountains of Guerrero, Mexico, who came to Los Angeles with nothing and built something that would eventually take more than 500 law enforcement officers and 2 separate federal RICO indictments to bring down. The street itself made control easy. Drew Street is a short dead end, mostly entered from one direction, with a hillside layout that narrows everything into a natural choke point. From lookout spots set before the cul-de-sac, they could see every car coming in, giving them 30 to 45 seconds to adjust, move product, clear the curb, and let the block settle back into something that looked ordinary before a patrol unit reached the end. At night, tires squealed and gunshots echoed, and neighbors learned to pull their curtains and stay inside. In some years, this single street accounted for a disproportionate share of violent crime across the LAPD's Northeast Division, which spans roughly 30 square miles. All of it concentrated into 2 blocks, a hillside street where, during the day, children still walked to school, still played in the yards, still tried to live something close to a normal life in the hours between when the business was running at full capacity. Officers from the Northeast Division tried everything, and they formed special task forces and eventually shut them down when nothing stuck. They ran undercover drug buys over and over, making arrests the operation absorbed without slowing down. They cut the trees back almost to their crowns just to see further into the block. Graffiti crews came every day, but the tags returned within hours, the same markings reclaiming the walls like the argument never ended. After repeated shootouts shattered them, they even encased the streetlights in protective housings. For a while, each effort seemed to make a dent, but it never held. Because the operation on Drew Street wasn't simply the product of gang activity, it was the product of a family. And dismantling a family requires something fundamentally different from shutting down a drug corner. One of Maria's sons, Daniel Leon, known on the street as Cleaver, often walked the block in broad daylight with an assault rifle in plain view, carrying himself with a kind of authority that made people cross the street rather than pass him. Mothers walking their children to school picked up their pace when he appeared, and kids learned early to keep their heads forward, the way you pick up certain instincts when you grow up where danger is always there. Inside the house, camera feeds flickered across a monitor in the living room, where Maria or her sons watched for unmarked cars or uniforms. When something felt off, signals moved quickly between lookouts and runners. A whistle, a coded phrase, and within seconds the block shifted. Runners disappeared into houses or slipped through backyards onto nearby streets, and just as quickly, everything settled back into the look of an ordinary neighborhood, From the outside, it would have been easy to assume that an operation this organized was directed by a patriarch, a male shot caller with prison credentials and a long violent reputation. In reality, the web of narcotics distribution, extortion, and intimidation that defined Drew Street coalesced around María Chata León. Barely 5 feet tall and slightly over 100 pounds by most accounts, she commanded loyalty and fear in a neighborhood and a criminal subculture that had never produced anyone quite like her. Her journey from an impoverished, undocumented immigrant to the matriarch of the Drew Street clique is one of the most extraordinary and least told true crime stories in the history of Los Angeles. This is that story, but to understand what she built, you have to understand where she came from. The specific place, the specific conditions, the specific narrowness of the world she was born into, and the choices it offered her. How does a mother build something this powerful? You have to start at the beginning. The mother who built a gang. To understand María León, you have to understand Tlalchapa, not just as a dot on a map, a municipality in the Tierra Caliente region of Guerrero in southwestern Mexico, but as a condition. The Tierra Caliente, which translates to the hot land, is a stretch of interior geography straddling parts of Guerrero, Michoacán, and Mexico State, known for scorching summer temperatures, entrenched poverty, and a history of violence that runs deep into the land itself. The region has historically produced some of Mexico's most dangerous criminal organizations and some of its most desperate immigrants, sometimes, as journalist Sam Quinones observed in his reporting on Drew Street, from the same families. Tlalchapa was a small agricultural community, the kind of place where the economy rests on subsistence farming and whatever money flows in from relatives who made it north. No industrial base, no real professional infrastructure. The way out, for generations of families, was the United States border. Families from Tlalchapa and the surrounding Tierra Caliente municipalities made that crossing and, over time, gravitated toward a specific corner of Los Angeles, the hillside enclave of Glassell Park in the Northeast Division, where relatively affordable rents and an existing community of fellow Guerrero immigrants made the transition bearable. Quinones documented how this pattern of chain migration created in Glassell Park a neighborhood within a neighborhood, a community where the social fabric of Tlalchapa was partially reconstructed on the hillsides of Los Angeles, down to the extended family networks, the unspoken codes, and the deep wariness of outsiders that develops in communities living outside the reach of official legal protection. María León arrived in Glassell Park in the mid-1980s, likely in her late teens or early 20s. She was one of thousands making the same journey, one more young woman from Guerrero navigating a city that didn't particularly notice she had arrived. In the beginning, she did what many around her did. She worked, she babysat children in the neighborhood, she cleaned houses, she reportedly sold paletas from a cart, the same kind of street vending she might have done back home. She later told probation officers that she had also sold gold jewelry door to door and had at certain points received public assistance. By every visible measure, she was unremarkable. A young undocumented woman navigating the precarious informal economy that existed in the margins of Los Angeles. But the neighborhood she had arrived in was not a neutral space, and María León was not someone who stayed passive in the face of her circumstances for long. The Avenues gang had been a presence in Northeast Los Angeles since at least the 1950s, emerging from the Mexican-American communities of Highland Park, Glassell Park, and Cypress Park. Like many of the street gangs that took root in mid-century Los Angeles, the Avenues formed, in part, as a response to the displacement and disinvestment that followed urban renewal and infrastructure projects that cut through or eliminated established neighborhoods. The Chavez Ravine clearance, which ultimately resulted in Dodger Stadium being built on land where a Mexican-American community had lived for generations, and the construction of freeways that bisected Northeast LA neighborhoods contributed to a landscape in which many young Mexican-American men had lost community anchors and institutional support. The Avenues emerged in that context, young men asserting identity and forming protective bonds in neighborhoods that felt increasingly precarious. By the time María arrived in the mid-1980s, the Avenues had been established for 3 decades. They were not a casual youth clique. They were an institution with defined turf, a layered internal hierarchy, and relationships to larger criminal structures. Most critically, to the Mexican mafia, known as La M. La M is a prison-based gang that by the 1980s had consolidated its influence over dozens of Southern California street gangs. The arrangement was systematic. Southern California street gangs, including the Avenues, were expected to operate their drug markets under La Ame's authorization and to pay a portion of their revenue, a tax, to Mexican mafia shot callers issuing directives from inside federal penitentiaries. Gangs that failed to comply faced the possibility of La MA sanctioning their removal. This structure created a form of organized crime governance over street-level activity across Los Angeles, decentralized enough to survive the arrests of individual leaders, but coordinated enough to extract revenue from a vast network of local operations. It was into this world that Maria Leon's criminal career took shape. Her first documented arrest came in 1985 for assault with a deadly weapon, then 1986, theft and burglary, then 1992, possession of PCP and marijuana for sale. Between 1992 and 1997, she accumulated multiple arrests for drug felonies and extortion. Each encounter with the justice system produced modest consequences: short jail terms, probation, deportation orders. She was deported to Mexico at least twice and returned both times, using smuggling networks to re-enter the United States. By the time she was taken into federal custody in 2008, her documented arrest history stretched back more than 2 decades, accumulating into a portrait not of bad luck but of persistent, deliberate criminal enterprise, and of a system that kept treating each arrest as an isolated incident rather than a pattern. The transition from small-time seller to the operational center of the Drew Street clique was gradual, driven by a combination of economic desperation, personal ambition, and structural opportunity. When you are an undocumented woman with a growing number of children and no legitimate path to financial stability, and your neighborhood is organized around an illegal economy that generates more in a day than domestic work produces in a month, the logic of participation is not difficult to follow. But what separated Maria Leon from others who might have made the same calculation was what she did once she made it. She didn't stop at survival. She built. She began the way most people in that world begin, selling small quantities out of the house to people she knew, then to people they knew. The crack cocaine epidemic of the late 1980s and early 1990s had reshaped the economics of street-level drug sales across American cities, and Los Angeles was among the most severely affected. Crack was cheap to manufacture, generated enormous demand, and moved quickly at the retail level. For a woman with a house, a roster of family members who could serve as lookouts and runners, and a dead-end street with limited police visibility, the logistical infrastructure for a sustained drug operation was already in place. She just had to be willing to use it. One of the central relationships in Maria's rise was with Francisco Pancho Real, the father of at least 2 of her children, and one of the more respected figures in the Drew Street clique. Their partnership, as Pancho himself would later describe it to federal investigators, divided along clear functional lines. He handled the outward-facing criminal activity, extortion, territorial enforcement, distribution management, while Maria controlled the house, the product flow, and the family. He told prosecutors that she had been selling drugs since the late 1980s, that she had grown the operation alongside the gang's own expansion, and that she was fully capable of running it without his presence, and did. This testimony, delivered in exchange for a reduced federal sentence, was among the most damaging evidence presented against her at trial. By the late 1990s, the satellite house was running with a discipline that was difficult to square with the image of an immigrant woman simply trying to get by. The operation had a clear division of labor, organized along family lines. Older sons packaged narcotics, crack cocaine and methamphetamine, into small units, weighed and inventoried with the kind of precision that any legitimate distribution operation would recognize. Runners, often younger family members or the girlfriends of gang members, delivered product to customers at the curb or at designated nearby drop points, using disposable phones that could be discarded at the first sign of a problem. The phones rang constantly. Pancho Real told federal investigators that at its peak, the operation was generating approximately $1,200 per day in drug revenue. A portion funded household expenses. Another portion flowed upward to Mexican mafia leadership as tribute. The remainder was reinvested. More product, more weapons, upgraded surveillance equipment. Daniel Leon, clever, was the most visible embodiment of the security structure. He was young, barely out of his teens when he became the clique's most feared enforcer, and he had grown up inside the satellite house, shaped by everything it represented. According to reports that circulated at the time, Danny had undergone LASIK surgery to correct poor vision, and the detail, whether entirely accurate or partially exaggerated by the time it reached the street, said something true about how he operated. With calculated deliberateness, as someone who took the work seriously. He carried his rifle openly because openness was its own deterrent. You don't need to fire a weapon if people believe unconditionally that you will. Jose Leon, the eldest son, functioned as a lieutenant, supervising operations, managing communication between the house and the street, making decisions in crisis situations that were designed to protect the family's interests above all else. Nicolas Real, born from Maria's relationship with a different partner, was identified by law enforcement as another shot caller within the clique, managing distribution alongside Pancho and serving as an intermediary between the house's operations and the street-level members. His name appeared in civil nuisance abatement proceedings as one of the individuals specifically barred from the property, indicating that law enforcement had flagged him as central to the operation well before federal charges were filed. Randy and Jesus Martinez, younger brothers, occupied the tier below, foot soldiers being absorbed into the operation through constant exposure, learning by watching, by participating, by coming to understand that this was simply the shape of life in the house they had grown up in. The daughters occupy a quieter corner of the public record, less documented in court filings and press coverage, but no less present in the operation. Some allegedly served as lookouts, their gender providing a degree of cover that a young man standing on the same corner for 2 hours would not have had. Others reportedly handled financial logistics, managing the flow of money and coordinating with suppliers. In a system this tightly organized, every position carries a function. Every person inside it is, to some degree, implicated. Inside the house, the Malverde shrine burned steadily. Jesus Malverde is a folkloric figure from Sinaloa, a bandit from the early 20th century, possibly apocryphal, who became a patron saint figure among narco-traffickers in Mexico and eventually among drug dealers in the United States. Whether Maria's devotion was genuine religious faith, superstition, or a deliberate performance of shared cultural identity that reinforced the loyalty of those around her is impossible to determine from the outside. What mattered was its function. It framed the operation as something ordained, something larger than the sum of its criminal parts. The family wasn't simply a gang. In the logic cultivated inside those walls, they were a chosen unit, protected by something the law couldn't reach. The neighborhood knew. It had always known. Eusterbio Renteria, who had lived on Drew Street since 1972 and watched 2 of his own sons absorbed by the gang over the years, watched the operation grow year by year from his front porch. He said nothing publicly for a long time, not because he was indifferent, but because silence was rational. This was the ecosystem Maria had built, one where speaking to police meant risking everything you had left, and where keeping quiet at least preserved the illusion of safety. Some residents, it should be said, existed in a transactional relationship with the operation. The gang provided a form of informal protection from outside criminal elements, the same way protection economies always produce beneficiaries alongside victims. But for most people on that block, the experience was simply one of enduring something that could not be fought and could not be escaped. Teachers at Fletcher Drive Elementary School, a few blocks from Drew Street, described students arriving exhausted, not the ordinary tiredness of childhood, but the bone-deep fatigue of people whose sleep had been interrupted night after night by gunshots and police helicopters circling overhead. The school's principal described a pervasive background anxiety in the student body that never fully lifted. These were children normalizing something that should never have been normalized and paying for that normalization in their concentration, their rest, their sense of safety in spaces designed to protect them. Residents developed a set of unspoken survival protocols. Don't look directly at the men on the corner. Don't linger near the house when traffic is moving. Don't answer strangers' questions. And above all, don't answer questions from police. Not out of loyalty to the gang, but because loyalty to the gang was the only thing standing between you and a brick through your window, or your own son being pulled into something he couldn't walk away from. The Drew Street clique's rivalries sharpened the violence and made it unpredictable. Their primary adversaries in Northeast Los Angeles included gangs from the Cypress Park and Frogtown areas. Territory disputes produced regular shootings along contested borders. The clique also operated within the broader Avenues network, meaning that conflicts in other parts of Northeast LA could ripple back to Drew Street. An incident in Highland Park producing a retaliatory shooting in Glassell Park. Violence that appeared geographically scattered but was organizationally connected. And connecting it all was the Mexican mafia, its shot callers in federal prisons issuing instructions that filtered down through multiple layers before reaching the street, tying a small cul-de-sac in Glassell Park to the largest prison-based criminal organization in Southern California. The Avenue's violence was not limited to narcotics disputes. Federal civil rights prosecutions in 2006 and 2007 revealed that members of the Avenues had conducted a sustained campaign of racially motivated harassment and violence against Black residents in the Highland Park area, a pattern that prosecutors described as an organized effort to drive African American residents from Avenue's claimed territory. Gang members including Gilbert Saldana, Alejandro Martinez, and Fernando Cazares were convicted in connection with a conspiracy that included the murders of Kenneth Wilson and Christopher Bowser. A separate prosecution resulted in life sentences for Porfirio Avila and co-defendants. These were among the first federal hate crime convictions ever obtained against a street gang, and they illustrated something important about what the Avenues had become. Not simply a criminal enterprise protecting its economic interests, but an organization enacting a violent ideological project about who was permitted to exist in which neighborhoods. The Drew Street clique was the revenue engine and one of the enforcement arms of this broader structure. And at the center of the Drew Street clique was the Satellite House, and at its center, a woman who by the mid-2000s had built something that the vast majority of male gang leaders in Los Angeles never achieved: a fully integrated, family-based criminal operation running with the organizational coherence of a small cartel in a subculture that had never considered a woman capable of building it. Street gangs in Los Angeles have been, without exception, patriarchally organized. Leadership defaults to men. Women in gang structures occupy supplementary roles. They carry messages, provide safe houses, sustain relationships with incarcerated members, but they do not typically command, do not typically direct the men around them, and are rarely the people that Mexican mafia shot callers conduct business with as equals. Research on female gang participation consistently places women at the margins of gang organizations, not their centers. What Maria Leon did was genuinely outside the template, wielding authority that men with far longer violent resumes respected, leveraging her role as mother and household anchor as an organizational tool, using the one resource the gang world consistently undervalues: blood loyalty, which in her case meant 13 people who were bound to her before they understood what they were being bound to. She did not rise through the organization the way a man would have, through accumulated violence, through fear, through the slow acquisition of credibility that comes from bodies and prison time. She rose by being irreplaceable, by providing what no one else could: a fixed, trusted center, a house that never moved, a network of people whose loyalty was guaranteed not by fear alone, but by the deepest social obligation that exists. She was their mother, and in a world where trust is the scarcest resource of all, she had 13 people obligated to trust her before they had a choice in the matter. Then came the day when everything started to crack. It didn't happen all at once. That's never how these things go. The end of something this embedded, this insulated by silence, fear, organizational redundancy, and a family structure that kept regenerating itself every time the law removed a member, doesn't arrive in a single decisive moment. It fractures first, along lines of stress that have been accumulating for years, pressure building in the structure until something gives, and then something else, and then suddenly everything is coming apart faster than anyone inside it can stop. The first serious fracture came on Halloween night, 2002. Police executed a search warrant on the property at 3304 Drew Street and found exactly what you'd expect inside a fortified drug operation that had been running for over a decade: a Tech-9 machine pistol, cocaine and marijuana, ammunition, a small explosive device, a cell phone ringing, actively ringing while officers stood in the living room, with customers placing drug orders as if the raid were simply a scheduling interruption. And in the back rooms of that same house, 6 children under 10 years old living within the operation, including one infant, 3 months old, sleeping in a crib while the enterprise continued around him. The Malverde shrine burned in one room, the candles still lit. The charges that followed were significant. Jose Leon pleaded guilty to drug possession for sale and received 4 years. Maria herself pleaded guilty to child endangerment and possession of an assault weapon, receiving a 6-year sentence, but with credit for time served and a subsequent transfer to immigration authorities. Her actual time incarcerated was considerably shorter than the number suggests. She was deported to Mexico. Within roughly a year, she was back in Los Angeles. The operation resumed as if the raid had been a minor scheduling disruption rather than a criminal conviction. This is the part of the story that reveals something important about the limits of conventional law enforcement responses to a family-based criminal network. Arresting individual members doesn't dismantle the organization. It creates temporary vacancies. When Maria was deported, Her sons filled the space she left. When Jose went to prison, Nicola and Danny absorbed his responsibilities. The clique was redundant by design because the family was the design, and the family didn't go away simply because some of its members were temporarily removed. In 2005, the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office tried a different instrument. Using civil law rather than criminal prosecution, they moved to have the satellite house declared a public nuisance, a designation that would allow the court to bar specific individuals from the property and potentially enable its eventual seizure. The resulting injunction prohibited 54 people, including Maria and several of her children, from being present at or near the premises. The family relocated temporarily to Victorville, a high desert city roughly 2 hours northeast of Los Angeles, and by some external appearances, the Drew Street operation quieted. Law enforcement sources, however, reported that Maria was continuing to direct operations remotely, using phones and family intermediaries to maintain oversight from a distance. When the family eventually returned, having satisfied the legal requirements to reoccupy the property, it was as if the injunction had been not a disruption, but an inconvenience, a compliance formality that the operation absorbed and moved past. Then February 21, 2008 arrived, and with it a set of events that even the most adaptive family operation could not simply absorb. That morning, Danny Leon, Cleaver, along with his cousin Jose Gomez and Randy Martinez, were allegedly involved in the murder of Marcos Salas. Salas, according to investigators, had refused to pay drug taxes to the Drew Street clique. In the logic that governed the clique's extortion operation, this kind of refusal was not simply a financial loss. It was a challenge to the authority structure that the clique had spent years enforcing. If one person refused and faced no consequences, others would follow. The calculation was brutal and consistent. Non-compliance had to produce a visible final outcome. Salas was shot dead outside an elementary school in the Cypress Park neighborhood, roughly a mile from Drew Street. His body was left in the parking lot where parents would drop off their children in a few hours. Police responded quickly. When officers located the suspect's vehicle on Drew Street, Danny Leon did not surrender. He retreated into the satellite house, retrieved his assault rifle, and opened fire on undercover LAPD officers from the front of the property. The gun battle that followed was brief. Danny was shot and killed. His cousin Jose Gomez was wounded and arrested. 2 other men were taken into custody and charged in connection with the Salas murder. Danny Leon was 22 years old. He had grown up inside the satellite house, been shaped by everything it was and everything it demanded, and died defending it with the weapon he had been carrying for years. To law enforcement and the broader community, his death could have looked like an ending. The removal of the clique's most dangerous member, proof that the Avenue's grip on Drew Street could be broken. To the people who had grown up with him, to the surviving sons and nephews and associates who had spent their entire lives inside this world, it was something else. It was a martyrdom. And in the moral logic of the street, a martyrdom demands a response. That response came 6 months later, on August 2nd, 2008. Deputy Juan Abel Escalante was an off-duty Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy, a father, a Cypress Park resident who lived in the same communities he served professionally. By all accounts, he was the kind of officer who stayed embedded in his neighborhood, the kind whose presence in a community was about more than a uniform and a shift. He was shot and killed outside his home in what investigators almost immediately recognized as an intentional act of retaliation. Wiretaps that law enforcement had been running since the February gun battle captured what investigators needed. In a recorded conversation, Carlos Stoney Velasquez, Maria Leon's nephew, told Jose Leon that he had killed Escalante to avenge Danny's death. Jose's response, according to court documents, was to promise Stoney financial support and to assure him that his interests would be protected inside prison. The conversation was damning, specific, and exactly the kind of evidence federal prosecutors needed to convert a local gang investigation into a federal racketeering case. The murder of a law enforcement officer changed the institutional calculus entirely. It is a grim but well-documented truth about American policing that the deaths of civilians, even sustained or repeated civilian deaths in a community like Glassell Park, even 2 decades of funerals and terrorized school children and a neighborhood living in ambient fear, rarely unlock the kind of resources and political urgency that the death of an officer produces. The people of Drew Street had been living with this violence since before some of the younger gang members were born. The LAPD had mounted task forces. The city attorney had filed civil nuisance suits. Officers had trimmed the trees and encased the streetlights and come every day to paint over the graffiti. None of it had permanently changed the fundamental situation. Deputy Escalante's murder changed the level of the response. A federal racketeering case, coordinated across multiple agencies, was now the instrument. On June 24, 2008, the United States Department of Justice unsealed a federal indictment charging 70 members and associates of the Drew Street clique with a sweeping array of crimes: racketeering, murder, attempted murder of law enforcement officers, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, firearms violations, home invasion robbery, and extortion. The indictment alleged that the clique had controlled life on and around Drew Street through sustained violence and the threat of violence, that it had collected taxes from independent drug dealers in its territory, forwarding portions to Mexican mafia leadership in federal prisons, that it had committed murders and directed attacks on rivals, witnesses, and police. This was not a narcotics bust targeting street-level dealers. This was a structural prosecution, deploying the RICO statute, the same legal instrument originally designed to dismantle Italian-American organized crime in the 1970s, to treat the Drew Street clique as precisely what it was: a criminal enterprise with a defined hierarchy, a revenue structure, and a sustained pattern of organized criminal activity. The following morning at 4 a.m., more than 500 law enforcement officers executed 25 simultaneous search warrants across Glassell Park and surrounding neighborhoods. LAPD officers, federal agents, county deputies, 28 people were arrested that morning. 26 more were already in custody from prior arrests. 16 remained at large. Officers seized 28 firearms. Inside the satellite house, raided again, they found hidden compartments, surveillance equipment, and financial records, ledgers, distribution lists, documentation of tax collection, and upward payments to La M, along with cell phone footage of Danny Leon brandishing his rifle in the days before the February shootout. Prosecutors were not simply arresting people, they were documenting an organization. In April 2008, months before the RICO indictment was unsealed, María Leon had already been taken into federal custody. Agents arrested her outside her former home on Drew Street on a charge of illegal re-entry, a federal felony that carries a maximum sentence of 20 years, and that her long pattern of deportation and return had finally made prosecutable in a way that would hold her in custody. The re-entry charge was the opening move. By the time the racketeering indictment was complete, she was named as a central defendant, charged with racketeering conspiracy and conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. She was in her mid-40s, and the network she had built was coming apart at every joint. The person most directly responsible for that unraveling was one of her own sons, Francisco Pancho Real, facing a federal racketeering charge that would almost certainly mean decades in prison, made the decision that the rest of the family would never forgive. He cooperated with the government. He sat across from federal prosecutors and gave them the architecture of the operation, the structure of the clique, his mother's role at its center, the logistics of the tax system, the relationships with Mexican mafia leadership, the locations of hidden compartments, the identities of individuals connected to specific crimes. He described in detail what he had helped build, piece by piece, for years. In exchange, he received a substantially reduced sentence and was eventually placed in a witness protection, separated from his family, his neighborhood, the entire world that had formed him, relocated to somewhere the geography of which cannot be made public. Among the people he'd grown up with, his name became something close to profanity. A second major federal action followed in September 2009. A new indictment charged 88 members of the Avenues with federal racketeering in a case that alleged the Mexican mafia was actively attempting to reorganize the gang in the aftermath of the Drew Street takedown. Approximately 1,300 law enforcement officers executed the raids connected to this action, arresting 45 more individuals and seizing 33 additional firearms. The charging document ran to 222 pages and described in granular detail the mechanics of La M's communications from inside federal penitentiaries, through prison visitors, through coded correspondence, through the occasional attorney, and how street-level cliques like Drew Street had funneled tribute money upward through the structure. It was a picture of organized crime that extended far beyond a single house on a single dead-end street in Glassell Park, connecting that house to a statewide criminal infrastructure. Carlos "Stoney" Velasquez was eventually captured and, like Pancho Real before him, ultimately cooperated with prosecutors. He was convicted of Deputy Escalante's murder, received a life sentence, and became eligible for parole consideration through his cooperation. The recorded wiretap conversation, in which he admitted the killing was among the most significant pieces of evidence produced by the entire investigation. One by one, the family came apart in federal court. Randy and Jesus Martinez, charged in connection with the murder of Marcos Salas, were convicted and sentenced to lengthy federal terms. Jose Leon and Nicolas Real faced substantial sentences for racketeering and drug distribution. Danny was dead. Pancho was in witness protection. The daughters and extended family members were variously charged, investigated, or left to reconstruct whatever lives remained possible after the dismantling of the only world they had ever known. The Leon family, which had operated as a self-reinforcing, redundant, blood-loyal structure for 20 years, was dismantled almost entirely. María Leon entered a guilty plea to racketeering conspiracy and conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. A federal judge sentenced her to 100 months, 8 years and 4 months. She appealed the sentence, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed it in 2011. Upon completion of her federal term, she was to be deported. During her incarceration, she reportedly attempted to arrange travel back to the United States through a smuggling network to attend the funeral of her son, Danny, the same method she had used for previous re-entries. The attempt was discovered by law enforcement. She remained in custody. After serving her sentence, she was deported to Mexico. Her current whereabouts are not publicly known. On February 5, 2009, an excavator arrived on Drew Street and began tearing the satellite house down. It took approximately 30 minutes to reduce the structure to a debris field. Los Angeles City Attorney Rocky Delgadillo, whose office had pursued the civil nuisance action against the property years earlier, stood nearby and called the demolition a symbol of the neighborhood's reclamation of itself. LAPD officers who had spent years working that street watched the building come down. One officer, Steve Aguilar, who had patrolled Drew Street through some of its worst years, stood near the perimeter and said 2 words: "It feels good." Eusterbio Renteria, who had lived on Drew Street since 1972 and watched 2 of his sons absorbed by the gang over the decades, also watched. He said they should have done it 10 years earlier. The cleared lot became a community garden. Residents who had lived in fear for the better part of 20 years began tending it. Children from Fletcher Drive Elementary School, the same school whose students had come to class exhausted from sleepless nights, played in a space where fear had been the only thing reliably produced for as long as any of them could remember. In the years that followed the demolition and the federal prosecutions, violent crime in the area declined significantly. Police reported drops in violent incidents from peak levels recorded earlier in the decade. The elementary school principal described her students as better rested. Residents who had refused for years to speak with police began providing information. Community cooperation that officers had not experienced on those streets in a generation started to emerge, slowly, tentatively, but genuinely. But not everything changed. The Avenue's gang did not disappear. It contracted, reorganized, and adapted, as it had always adapted across more than half a century of law enforcement pressure. New cliques consolidated in other sections of Northeast Los Angeles. Mexican mafia leadership continued to operate from inside federal penitentiaries, exerting influence through the same channels it had always used, undisturbed by the removal of individual shot callers who were replaced as a matter of organizational routine. The economic conditions that had made Drew Street what it was, the poverty, the immigration precarity, the structural abandonment of communities that exist too far outside the mainstream for policy to consistently reach them, remained in place. The garden was real. The drop in violence was real. The transformation of that specific block was real. But the conditions that produced the satellite house had not been demolished along with it. What do you call it when a mother raises her children to go to war for her? When the crib sits against the wall while the guns are counted on the table in the next room. When the first coded signals a toddler learns are the warnings that mean police are coming. When the family meal is also a business meeting. When the house you grew up in is also a fortress. When the only childhood you've ever known is one in which loyalty to the family and loyalty to the operation are the same thing, and no one in your life has ever suggested they might be different. Maria Chata Leon came to Los Angeles with nothing. That much is confirmed by the record. What she built from that nothing, the network, the system, the fortified compound, the machine that turned narcotics into revenue and revenue into power, and power into the kind of fear that silences a whole neighborhood for 2 decades, is also confirmed. What no court document fully captures is the cost. Not to the city, not to the police department, not even primarily to Deputy Escalante's family, though that cost was real and enormous and deserves its own full accounting. The cost to her children. Daniel Leon died at 22 years old in a gun battle he started, with a weapon he had been carrying since adolescence, because he had grown up in a house where carrying a weapon was simply what the men around him did. Randy Martinez is serving decades in federal prison for a murder he was allegedly involved in before he was old enough to legally rent a car. Jose and Nicolas and Jesus, years of their lives swallowed by federal sentences for crimes that were not entirely separable from the circumstances of their upbringing. And Francisco Pancho Real is somewhere in witness protection, cut off from his family, his neighborhood, the community that formed him, in exchange for a reduced sentence and the anonymity of a relocated identity. The daughters moved through a space between complicity and victimhood that the public record has never fully mapped. Their stories mostly untold, their lives shaped by something none of them chose before they were old enough to understand what choosing meant. 13 children, one house, 2 decades of an operation so entrenched that it required hundreds of law enforcement officers across multiple agencies, 2 federal RICO indictments, civil nuisance litigation, sustained immigration enforcement, and the murder of a sheriff's deputy to bring it down. The satellite house is gone. A garden grows in its place, people tend it, living things that require patience and care, and the willingness to invest in something that returns slowly and cannot be hoarded. In every functional sense, the garden is the opposite of what stood there before. Where the house extracted from the neighborhood, the garden gives back. Where the house was sealed and fortified, the garden is open. Where the house operated on fear, the garden requires trust. But the children who grew up inside those walls, who slept in cribs next to the product, who learned to count money before they learned to read, who were handed roles in a criminal organization before they were given any genuine choice about whether they wanted those roles. Those children carry Drew Street inside them wherever they are now, scattered across federal prisons far enough from Los Angeles that visiting is not a realistic possibility, somewhere in witness protection, at an address that will never be made public, in whatever lives the survivors are building from whatever remains after the collapse of the only world they knew. Power and family and survival, when you compress them together tightly enough, for long enough, across enough years and enough people, stop being separable things. They become one thing. And when that thing finally breaks, as it always breaks eventually, what's left is not simply the absence of a gang. It is the absence of a world. The only world that some of those 13 children ever had access to. The excavator took 30 minutes to knock down the house. It took 20 years to build what it became. And no federal prosecution, no civil injunction, no LAPD task force, no community garden has yet figured out how long it takes to undo what growing up inside something like that does to a child. What it costs to be born into a criminal enterprise before you are old enough to know that is what it is, and to carry that weight forward into whatever comes after. That math, unlike everything else on Drew Street, has never been simple.